Another thing you may have heard about these current tariffs is this argument that tariffs used to work for America. Why won't they work now? You'll see charts like these that might show how high the tariff rate was of products coming into America, how much revenue it made for the government, the things it offset, and how the economy still continued to boom. And look, that's accurate. No one's arguing that precision tariffs and even broader tariffs didn't work back then. The problem, however, is assuming that what worked for America in the 17, 18, and very early 1900s is applicable to America today, or even something we want. Tariffs did work back then. Let's take the tariffs of 1828, which, until this past week, was one of the highest tariffs ever applied broadly in American history. At the time, the US set a tariff of 45% on nearly all British goods, but specifically targeting textile mills, steel plants, and tool makers. This is because America was starting to go through mass industrialization. There was a huge demand for more steel, more textiles, more tools. But America didn't yet have the production capacity for it, but it had an interest in building it out, because those were comparably good-paying jobs at the time that America had a lot of skilled labor for, but just didn't have the factories. So instead of letting all that monetary value go to overseas manufacturers, they captured it as investment in new American industries. And at the time, these tariffs accounted for more than 90% of the government's income because there was so much demand for these goods that they still did have to buy from British products. There would have been no need for an income tax under this structure because of how much money was generated by these tariffs and customs duties. So why doesn't that work now? Back then we were building much simpler things out of fewer components from fewer places with lower consumption and competing against countries that had similar labor markets. For example, competing in manufacturing steel against a British steel mill, the workers were going to be paid roughly the same. The quality of the steel was roughly the same. The manufacturing process and standards were roughly the same. And the single piece of steel came from one place. Now let's compare that to something like your modern phone. Which today is a necessity. Depending on the specific phone model you buy, the components in your phone might be sourced from up to 40 different countries. While your phone might be designed in Cupertino, it could have a Japanese camera lens, a Korean memory chip, lithium from Chile, final assembly in China, Vietnam, or India, and hundreds of other small components. And the materials from those components might come from other countries to begin with as well. And that doesn't begin to get into packaging and shipping and port fees and custom duties. So the reality is that products we buy are more complex and interconnected than ever. We buy more products than ever. And the type of jobs that are valuable to the US mature economy are also different than the manufacturing jobs that we had historically. We're also competing with labor standards around the world that aren't comparable to the American standard. Health and safety regulations, environmental regulations, labor laws, child labor laws. The reality is that those aren't followed in a lot of countries. And because of that, the cost competition gap is massive. And while we should want to raise those standards globally, and while we want to bring manufacturing back to America, we also want to make sure that we're bringing good jobs to America that pay fair wages and provide a safe, livable life. Back then, America was built on a labor economy. 25% of our workforce was in manufacturing. Another large portion was in agriculture. And that meant there were decent paying jobs for all of Middle America. There weren't many high-income jobs. There wasn't as many consumers. The overall GDP per capita was much lower. The average living standard was much lower. Now we've shifted to what we call a knowledge economy. Tech, finance, healthcare, logistics, massive growth sectors. And that's why switching our economy from manufacturing to these knowledge-based industries meant we were producing less, but able to consume more and have a GDP and market that grew exponentially. The US economy skyrocketed because of this switch. To be able to offset even a portion of the global supply chain that is used in manufacturing domestically in the US would mean somewhere around half the country would have to work in factories. The reality is, most Americans are not going to want to do that because they have better jobs. It would also mean that while our production capacity goes up, our overall economy would shrink. We would have less surplus capital, we would have less discretionary spending, we would have less abundance. Maybe that's a good thing, but it's not what most Americans want right now. And more, especially in modern America, factories aren't heavy labor-intensive things. There's an increasing amount of automation. That automation means that even if we bring these factories back domestically, we're likely putting more money and more margin into the profits of the owners of the factory, but we're not providing any new jobs for Americans because we've shipped them all out to robots. And so your prices go up, but you're not supporting American-made because you're not actually giving any Americans a good-paying job. In fact, you're displacing the little remaining blue-collar manufacturing that we have here, and that's a problem. So we still do use tariffs, but we don't use them as a blanket thing anymore. We don't use them as a way to raise revenue. We use them to close the gap of competition between foreign manufacturing and domestic production that we currently have. So yes, America used to make a great amount of its revenue from tariffs, and a blanket tariff strategy was great for early America during its industrialization period to allow it to invest in the industries it needed to grow, to not be dependent on British imports. But why doesn't that work today? Because we have a different job mix, a different consumer mix, and different competitors. Could you bring that type of manufacturing industry back to America and employ many Americans in that industry? Absolutely. It would not produce the kind of America we want. Everybody would make less, and have less opportunity. So the reason that no economist is proposing going back to a blanket tariff world of 1700s is because it's not the 1700s anymore.